Aloha and welcome. My name is Jason Hirata. I'm a real property fellow and member of the ABA Real Property Section's Green and Sustainable Transactions Committee and attorney with the Kamehameha Schools in Honolulu, Hawaii. And here in the middle of the Pacific, the sun is just coming up, but for those of us joining us on the East Coast and in the Midwest, it's probably the noon hour already. The Green and Sustainable Transactions Committee is very pleased to co-host this important webinar with Holly Carr of the U.S. Department of Energy's Greenlease Leaders program, and to advance what is a bigger conversation on how we can draft and transact to achieve really more sustainable commercial space leases. We're joined by a distinguished panel of presenters from the U.S. Department of Energy, the Institute for Market Transformation, and the law firm of Wendell, Rosen, Black & Dean. And I'm going to turn it over to Holly to introduce herself in more detail and her co-panelists and launch us into our webinar. So mahalo for joining us.
Thank you, Jason. It's lovely to have those Hawaiian influences today. As we get started, thanks to everybody for joining. My name again is Holly Carr. I'm with the U.S. Department of Energy. Specifically, I work in the Commercial Building Integration Group here at Department of Energy, and work with a number of market partners and other organizations to advance energy efficiency in commercial buildings. And I'm joined today by two panelists, Alex Harry. Alex is a program manager on the market engagement team at the Institute for Market Transformation. Alex develops cooperative working relationships with landlords, tenants, and property management groups and trade associates in order to devise long-term energy efficiency transformation on topics such as green leases, plug load reduction, and small business energy management. Alex works with varied audiences, including building owners, tenants, chambers of commerce, utility alliances, and consultants. And Alex will be describing our Greenlease Leaders program that IMT runs in collaboration and with support from the U.S. Department of Energy. And we also have on the panel Greg Ankenman. Greg is a partner with the Oakland, California law firm Wendell, Rosen, Black & Dean, LLP, where his practice focuses on real estate and business transactions, including commercial real estate sales, exchange, financing, asset acquisition, and lease transactions. Mr. Ankenman is a frequent speaker, panelist, and author on green leasing and other real estate topics for legal associations and real estate industry organizations and publications, including the International Council of Shopping Centers, ICSC, the National Retail Tenants Association, Greenbuild, the Building Owners and Managers Association, or BOMA, and the California Continuing Education of the Bar. So thank you both for being with us today. We really appreciate it. Next slide, please. So now we'd like to know just a little bit more about who is on the line with us today. You should be seeing a poll popping up for you to respond to. Let us know if you represent, presumably you are primarily attorneys on the call, although we do have another option. Let us know if you represent tenants, landlords, or both in leasing transactions. And once we have a few seconds here for your response, we'll see what you all said. All right, can we see the big reveal, Andrew? %44 of you are mysterious others. Okay. Well, we will have information about both the landlord and the tenant side of this transaction, how you can be leveraging the lease to really automate both energy and water savings for your clients in the lease. So hopefully everybody on the line, regardless of your affiliation, will find some useful information here. And at the end, we will have a Q&A period that I hope will be pretty beefy, so that folks who have experience with this and want to share either questions or comments about their experience with energy aligned leasing can share that as well. Next slide, please. And there we go. So just a little more detail on our agenda. I'm going to start us off with green leasing primer and some comments about the benefits of green or energy aligned leasing. I'll then turn it over to Alexandra, who will talk about our Greenlease Leaders recognition program. And then our in the field practitioner, Greg, will round it off with stories from the field and hopefully some in the trenches information about how to best implement Greenlease clauses for your clients. And then I will facilitate some Q&A at the end. All right, next slide, please. So all of the work that we do here at the Department of Energy around leasing is sort of guided by these principles, that tenants and landlords should both know how much energy their buildings use. Tenants and landlords should both pay for energy upgrades commensurate with the financial benefits that they receive from those upgrades, and that they should both realize savings from cost-effective maintenance and behavioral energy best practices that they undertake. I'm sure most of you realize that a lot of this has to do with the proverbial split incentive issue, where folks are not recognized or not receiving the benefits from the upgrades that they make to their tenant space. And so a lot of the work that we're doing in green leasing has to do with updating clauses and setting up systems within the lease for the entire life of the lease that make information available to both the tenant and the landlord that can help with these issues. Next slide, please. So what is a green lease or an energy aligned lease? Basically, these leases include clauses that equitably align the costs and benefits of energy and water efficiency investments between building owners and tenants. So a graphic example here of a couple of cases where this takes place. On the left-hand side, you can see that the landlord installs a new high-efficiency rooftop unit on the roof of the property. That unit, because it's high efficiency, it costs more, and therefore the tenant uses less energy and pays lower bills over the life of the lease. So within the lease, a pass-through clause or other agreement would allow the tenant to perhaps pay the incremental cost increase that the landlord would be paying to put in that high efficiency unit, and then the tenant reaps those benefits over the long, 5 to 10 years of the lease term. A second example here over on the right is the landlord installing solar panels on the rooftop and then offering the power from those solar panels to the tenant to be purchased in lieu of or as part of their power used in their retail store, and that power is offered at or below what the tenant could pay from the local utility. So the tenant benefits by having a consistent and stable energy source and energy cost over time from that solar, and also potentially reducing their greenhouse gas emissions if they're tracking those emissions at a corporate level. Next slide, please. So there are numerous benefits to including these sorts of clauses in your leases. A 2015 study from our friends at the Institute for Market Transformation suggests that utility bills can be reduced by up to 51 cents per square foot by implementing some of these best practices in the lease and in the build out. This can also result in increases in NOI, reduce occupancy costs for the tenant, increase occupant satisfaction, and last but certainly not least, improve tenant-landlord communication and that tenant-landlord relationship across the board. Next slide, please. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Alex Harriet, IMT. I do want to remind folks that we will be taking questions at the end of the session. So please feel free to use that question box on your webinar user interface to type in questions to us. We'll try to send those to the right person to respond to and address all those questions at the end. Alex?
Thanks, Holly. Thanks, everyone, for inviting me onto this great panel today. I'm really excited to talk to you all about green leasing and then share some of the resources that IMT and the U.S. Department of Energy have put together around green leasing, and really just kind of get some ideas out there on how you all as attorneys can help your clients take advantage of best practices, and maybe if you're inspired enough, maybe take on a green lease yourself. So I just wanted to go back a little bit and talk high level about what is a green lease and how is it beneficial to you all, and then why is this beneficial to your clients potentially. So first, green leasing in a nutshell is, as Holly had mentioned before, is focused on removing the split incentive. So getting both the tenant and the landlord to work together on implementing best practices around energy efficiency and water management and sustainability. So maybe some of your clients have mentioned they want a space that upholds LEED certification, that's leadership in energy and environmental design, or maybe there's a local ordinance that requires a landlord client to benchmark their energy usage, and maybe they need help in getting full building energy data from their tenant. So it's really about helping, from an attorney's perspective, green leasing can really give you all the opportunity to help your clients overcome some of those barriers that we're seeing in the current real estate market. And so just to take a look at the flashy logos on the screen, who has green leases? From a program that IMT and the U.S. Department of Energy runs, Greenlease Leaders, which I'll talk a little bit more, we've been able to recognize that about approximately 1.3 billion square feet of commercial real estate operates under a green lease. So the secret isn't the secret. It's the commercial real estate audience is really taken and seen value in green leasing, and you'll see as you take a look here that there's several Fortune 500 companies represented here: Capital One, Prudential, and then there's larger real estate investment trusts like Ackridge, Regency Centers, Boston Properties, et cetera. Even the federal government, the General Services Administration has really seen the value and has taken heart what it means to apply green leasing to their whole portfolio. Next slide. So as I mentioned before, Greenlease Leaders is a recognition program that honors commercial real estate leaders, both landlords and tenants and their brokers, on showing best practices to the market on what it means to develop and execute a green lease. So the program started in 2013, and as I mentioned before, it's recognized 1.3 billion square feet of commercial real estate space that's operating under a green lease. And so the program has kind of evolved since its 2013 inception to really, as I said before, showcase best practices in leasing. And it's also become a resource for not only people who kind of cracked the nut on what it means to execute a green lease, but it's also a space for people who want to execute their own green lease or at least develop a standard form. They can come and get technical resources from IMT and the Department of Energy. And really the biggest, what we really would like to see is we'd like to see a higher performance in lease space. We'd want to see these spaces performing as efficiently and as sustainably as possible. So for the next coming year, Greenlease Leaders has kind of raised the bar. As I mentioned before, a lot of people have already taken advantage and have had their companies recognized by Greenlease Leaders. And so for now, we're focused on raising the bar in a way and developing, and we've developed a new website. We've developed additional resources to help people understand what it means to develop a green lease, and we've also enhanced the recognition criteria in order to become a green lease leader in 2018. Next slide. And so for some of those enhancements that we have for the coming year include designating a silver and gold recognition. And so as I mentioned before, the folks that can apply are landlords, tenants, and brokers. And then there's also a team transaction, and that's where the three parties I just mentioned apply for green lease leaders as a team, and that's actually a fun one. You see all the different perspectives of people collaborating together in order to execute a green lease. So there are two recognition streams. There's a silver stream and a gold stream. For silver, there's a list of requirements in order to meet the first level of recognition. There's 2 prerequisites, and then there's a total of 9 credits, and you have the option to choose at least 5 of them. So you fulfill those requirements as a step 1. Step 2 is that you document that you've completed and met the requirements of that lease language in a standard lease form or a corporate policy. And then for those who are more aggressive and want to achieve gold, the requirement there is that you meet the silver level requirements, plus you demonstrate that the language and the language has actually been executed. So silver, you submit a lease form template. With gold, you show an executed lease. And then for the gold level recognition, there's another requirement of writing a case study. Next slide. And so I can drill down a little bit into what are some of the standard prerequisites and credits. For the prerequisites, as I said before, you have to meet at least 2 of them. And then for the credits, it kind of varies depending on which pathway you apply as, either as a landlord or as a tenant, but you have to meet at least 5 of them. And I'll highlight the 2 prerequisites. The big 2 that you see is that we require leases to show and identify a sustainability contact. So that's important because a lot of times you'll see one side of the transaction wants to know where they can get information about sustainability or energy management best practices. So identifying the sustainability contact in the lease has been valuable. And then the second prerequisite that we see is encouraging minimum energy efficient fit out requirements. I don't know if many of you are familiar with the new Energy Star for tenant space, but essentially we're asking for tenants to have new spaces fit out to meet the requirement for Energy Star for tenant space. And then as Holly mentioned before, the other prerequisite, and this is for those that are applying as landlords, is the cost recovery clause. Next slide. And so on this slide, I have, if any of you are really interested in seeing what Greenlease language looks like, here are some popular ones that we see, and that also align with the requirements in Greenlease Leaders. So as I mentioned, there's the cost recovery clause, which allows landlords to pass through capital improvements to their tenants, usually through amortization. The minimum energy efficient fit out, which requires that tenant spaces meet Energy Star tenant space or the equivalent. And then there's the whole building Energy Star disclosure, where a landlord is required to share with their tenant their Energy Star score. And then lastly, there's the tenant space energy disclosure, which is kind of the flip side of the whole building disclosure, where a tenant, if they're sub-metered or separately metered, would share that energy data to their landlord upon request. And I'm I'm hoping that these slides will be available if you, after the webinar, if you want to take a closer look into what goes into Greenlease language. Next slide. And so just if you would like to do further reading on what are the requirements for Greenlease Leaders, maybe if your firm is encouraged to apply, or maybe you have clients that you would like to nudge to apply for either Greenlease Leaders as a landlord or as a tenant. Next slide. And then I just want to highlight two of the big resources that IMT and DOE currently have. We have the Greenlease Library. If you're looking for case studies, more information on what goes into a Greenlease lease language, that sort of thing, other webinars, greenleaselibrary.com is the place to stop. And then we have, if you're looking for more details on what it takes to become a Greenlease leader, and to look at the reference guides that were shown on the previous slide, please visit greenleaseleaders.com. I will put in a shameless plug that if you are interested or you have a client that's interested in applying for Greenlease Leaders, we are now accepting applications, and applications are accepted on a rolling basis up to March 1st, 2018. So I encourage you, or if you want to nudge some of your clients, I encourage you all to apply. Next slide. And then if any of you need help, or you have additional questions on what is green leasing, how can you help your firm become a leader, or maybe some of your clients, please reach out to myself or Holly. We'd be happy to do a green lease checkup, provide recommendations and updates to policies and form documents. I can help you move through the application, or if you're interested in pursuing a case study, I definitely would love to talk that out with you. Thank you.
All right, thanks very much, Alex. Again, to attendees, feel free to send in questions through the question box there on your webinar interface. And we will move on to Greg and some of his best practices from his actual law practice. Greg.
Thanks, Holly. Thanks, Alex. I'm happy to be here. Well, I think one important thing to remember is as lawyers trying to do a green lease, that our role is to help our clients, whether it's a landlord or tenant, achieve their green objectives, and also to avoid or minimize pitfalls or undesirable consequences that might result if that is not done carefully. And so I'm going to talk about a few issues that I think are important, with some examples and some pointers that I've come across over the years. So next slide, please. The first one that I think is critically important is for the client to determine, and with your help, clearly define their green objectives. I first really thought about this when I was doing a lease for a tenant, and a landlord really early on in the lead process was trying to get a lead certification for a new project that was under construction. And they had this provision in the construction rider that essentially said that the tenant would comply with any and all green construction requirements that the landlord may impose. And as a tenant, even though that particular tenant I was representing was very dedicated, both in principle and from a business perspective, at pursuing green initiatives, they really couldn't do that, of course, just agree to sign a blank check that they would do whatever the landlord might ask. And that really wasn't very helpful either. So I think it's the effective leases I see are very clear and detailed in what either the landlord or the tenant is expecting or requiring of the other in terms of construction requirements and specifications and operational requirements. One thing that's very helpful is a detailed work letter or construction rider if the project involves very specific green construction. An example that many of you may have seen or heard of, Starbucks does this very well. A number of landlords, including Regency, do this well. I think that is a key and important thing. And that ties in with one of the Green Lease Leader tenant prerequisites, and that's a minimum energy efficient fit out requirements. If those are going to be met, they need to be spelled out and understood. Green Lease Leaders, I've been really pleased as I've studied and learned more about it and been a little bit involved in it. In my mind, it really complements and encourages the right things that fit in with what, in my experience, are the important points if you're going to have an effective green lease. So if you're going to implement another important Green Lease Leader credit is implementing energy management best practices. Again, if that's going to happen, it needs to be spelled out and communicated and understood. These could be many things, including energy efficient lighting, daylight harvesting, water efficient fixtures and landscaping, proper HVAC operation and maintenance, and so forth. But if these requirements are understood and spelled out in the lease, they're much more likely to be met effectively. Another one that's increasingly I'm seeing in leases is either a requirement or opportunity to purchase green power, or even ideally on-site renewables. And the Green Lease Leaders adds, I think, an important requirement that the tenant is, for this prerequisite or credit, the tenant is required to purchase on-site renewables if they're offered by the landlord and priced competitively. That to me is really important, that all of these things have to be fair and reasonable. And so if the landlord has the opportunity to provide on-site renewables, but for the tenant to be required to purchase them, it has to make economic sense. You have to be priced competitively. I see this increasingly among developers who are providing these opportunities, and of course, some tenants have renewables of their own. On the retail side, Kohl's has been a leader for years at having solar panels for electrical generation on their roofs, and even Starbucks, although they have a pretty small roof, they preserve the right to do that as it makes sense to them. So those are, I think, very important. Just once again, you got to know what you want and clearly define it and ask for it in order to achieve it. Next slide, please. The next point is to set up for success. You want to set yourself up for success, but also set the other side, the landlord or tenant on the other side, up for success. That, again, is done by having clear communication and coordination. That's important at every phase, both on each side and between the landlord and the tenant. Green Lease Leaders supports this by having the requirement to identify sustainability contact. As Alec mentioned, that's very helpful and important. The other thing to remember is among your side, whether you're on the landlord or tenant side, you need to coordinate and communicate among all the team members, brokers, deal makers, site selectors, design and construction, attorneys and others who negotiate leases, so that everybody is moving in the right direction toward the same objectives. In helping in the lease, if the green provisions are clear and easy to find and easy to follow, that helps set up for success as well. So I think one of the best practices is to have a green lease rider or easily identifiable green lease provision that consolidates, as makes sense, most of the green requirements so that they can be easily found and understood and reinforced. A really good practice that I understand a number of landlords are doing is that they will regularly, annually in some cases, reissue the green lease rider or guidelines to just as a reminder and to be sure that they're in front of the tenant. Sometimes, even though we spend a whole lot of time negotiating these wonderful lease provisions, people don't go back and read them every day. So that reminder can be really important. A lot of industry leading landlords are also providing other tools and guidelines for their tenants, where they regularly provide pointers and information that can help with the continued implementation of green practices. Alex talked about the split incentive, and it's very important to have provisions that properly allocate costs and benefits so that energy efficient practices make economic sense. The Green Lease Leaders recognizes as a prerequisite and a credit for the whether it's landlord or tenant a cost recovery clause, and that basically allows a landlord to pass through certain capital improvements or other costs that will improve energy efficiency, where the tenant agrees to pick up the costs, but also it's structured so the tenant over time is going to enjoy the benefits as well. The traditional lease structures of triple net on the retail side, or a pass-through of operating cost increases on the office side, really presented a roadblock to making some of the important and sensible provisions or measures make sense to improve energy efficiency. So it's really important to have an appropriate cost recovery provision. Another thing that helps and is important is to where it makes sense and is possible to separately meter or sub-meter tenant spaces. Green Lease Leaders gives a landlord credit for separately metering spaces over 5,000 square feet. My firm embraced the green lease and green operation early on, and so we had a traditional lease. We're in a high-rise office building with a common meter, and we started trying to put in lighting fixtures that were more efficient and other electrical equipment that was more efficient, and to use less water in our kitchen and our bathrooms. And it was really quite a problem. First, the lease didn't anticipate our putting in different fixtures than everybody else, and it was set up so that we didn't reap any particular direct benefit, since we were just paying a share of the cost. So we had to really fight with our landlord and educate our landlord to make that happen. And now many years later, our building has embraced it and required of other tenants. But without the separate meter, we didn't have the ability to really track what we were doing or recover the costs. So that's a really important thing where it's possible. Next slide, please. Tracking, verifying, and enforcing green lease measures and provisions, I think, can be as big a problem sometimes if it's not done correctly as the split incentive. The traditional lease remedies really often are not appropriate or adequate for, in an effective and efficient way, enforcing provisions for sustainability and energy efficiency. So for example, you don't really want to terminate the lease because the tenant is using too much electricity. And so what people struggled to figure out how best to address that. So an important thing is to confirm and try to ensure performance by having rights to monitor, to require reporting, and to inspect. And this can go both landlord or tenant, depending on which side you're on. You want to be sure the other side is doing what they're supposed to do. In some cases, it may be appropriate to have a self-help remedy. And people look to alternative dispute resolution, carefully designed sometimes, and targeted liquidated damages. Here we talk about, in this slide, disclosure, either building disclosure by the landlord of energy performance or tenant space energy disclosure. If those are not delivered when they're supposed to be delivered, perhaps some type of liquidated damages or other monetary penalty can be an incentive to get that to happen. You really need to think through how you are going to make sure this happens in a practical way and in a fair way. And it can also be viewed as a positive. If you are the landlord and you're trying to encourage the tenants to embrace their own energy efficient practices and to support the building practices and measures, if you're regularly publishing and requiring reports that show the performance and the results of those measures, that can be very important and useful. Next slide, please. And the last point that I want to make is, while you certainly don't want to miss the low-hanging fruit, the easy to change out inefficient lighting fixtures or water fixtures, or using more efficient appliances and office equipment and so forth, you also want to innovate, and a lot of situations provide unique and important opportunities. I worked on a deal in a mixed-use project a number of years ago, where the landlord was trying to encourage and provide support for employees of the office component of the mixed-use project to ride their bikes to work, and there were some local incentives that they were going to get if they met certain objectives in this regard. What they were finding is that the employees, and this was in a hot climate, the employees wanted to have shower facilities so that they could shower after they rode their bikes to work. There happened to be a health club that was going into this mixed-use project. So the landlord came up with the idea that perhaps the employees of the other tenants could use the showers of the health club after they rode their bikes to work. As you might imagine, the health club had some concerns about this. Of course, they were afraid that once these people came into the health club, they might work out without buying memberships, or they may just make the shower room too crowded and infringe on the experience of the club members. So it took quite a bit of negotiation and innovation to come up with a way where the landlord could achieve its objectives to provide this shower opportunity, and the health club tenant could also feel comfortable that they could do this in a way that would work with their operations. Another example that I've thought of on this regard that I've seen some innovators do is rainwater harvesting is another kind of innovative practice, both on the tenant and the landlord side. Walmart has done quite a bit of rainwater harvesting and drought-tolerant landscaping, and a number of landlords, including Pyramid, have as well. And being sure that the lease allows this to happen, if you're the tenant leasing property and you're trying to do this, or allows it from a landlord perspective with the tenant's cooperation is key. Another innovative practice that I've seen is landlords setting up energy efficient product buying pools for their tenants, and making those opportunities available to the tenants so the tenants can more economically acquire appliances, equipment that will be more energy efficient. On the retail side, Starbucks is a leader, and when I think of quite an interesting example, a few years back, they were trying to figure out a way to reduce the use of water, and they had a dripper well system where they had a faucet that was simple. I think, as I understand it, was just dripping water all the time that they used for cleaning as they were preparing beverages and so forth, and that used a lot of water. And they found out a way to replace these continuously running dripper wells with a metered faucet that saved hundreds of gallons of water every day. And they were able to do that because their lease was set up to allow them to make those kinds of changes and have the landlord cooperate. And then I wanted to mention a new challenge particularly for office users and landlords, and that is the trend in recent years to increased employee density. Lots of people, given the increase in office rents and other considerations, are packing more employees per square foot into buildings. And that presents a new challenge if you're going to try to reduce the amount of energy that's being used, but you have more energy users and water users in the space. So I don't have a whole lot of answers yet. This is kind of new, but I know that landlords are imposing restrictions on how many people per square foot, and they're monitoring that. I think increased development and use of energy efficient equipment and lighting is probably going to be key. Figuring out ways to share space and not use more energy is going to be important. I think this is an area where innovation is going to be important. And I also there become other considerations. Just how do these increased number of people get to work? Where do they park if they're driving? So that leads to transportation considerations that may not affect energy of the building, but certainly affect energy in the community and in the environment. So again, my kind of closing pointers are that you need to clearly identify what you want and spell it out, think it through, plan and draft the lease to accomplish what the landlord or tenant is after. To be sure you've set up ways to make this successful, and to track, verify, enforce, and encourage proper performance and implementation, and to be sure to innovate and in each situation figure out a way to take advantage of the opportunities and challenges that the situation presents. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Greg. Really appreciate your insights from actually practicing with these concepts and getting these types of clauses into leases and learning from those things. We have a few questions here from the audience, a few clarifying questions. Some of your questions we responded to individually, and I'm going to go ahead and cover some of those because I think they might be relevant to other folks. Feel free to type in additional questions as we're speaking here as well. One kind of key question we got from someone was, where can I find some of these lease clauses? Where can I find language to put into my leases? And Victoria, if you are able to show us the Greenlease Leaders website, maybe we can just take a peek at the resources that are right up there and easily available for folks to use. So this is the Greenlease library. And Victoria, could you go to the Greenlease Leaders website first and we can go from there? There we go. So this is the main homepage for the Greenlease Leaders program that you've been hearing about. This is the nexus of all the activity here at IMT and DOE on this topic. If you go to the top bar there under resources, oh, yeah, I see what you're doing. We also have this tab at the very top, which goes to the Greenlease library. This is a really amazing resource of clauses that have been made available publicly from all kinds of different organizations. And you can see there are case studies here from many different organizations, as well as individual lease clauses on specific topics that you can just search for and pull, cut and paste and use for your own practice here. So this is probably the primary resource available for folks who are looking to put clauses into leases that you're updating or developing. If you go back to the Greenlease Leaders website, we've curated some of these resources for you. So if you click on the resources hyperlink at the very top, the first things you'll see here are the reference guides for tenants and landlords. So if you're developing or updating a lease for a landlord client, you can use the landlord reference guide, and for each individual credit or prerequisite that Alex described, you'll see lease language or links to helpful documents. Sometimes the proposed or draft lease language is right in there in the reference guide that you can cut and paste, edit as you will, and use. And the same goes on the other side. If you can scroll down a little bit, Victoria, for the Greenlease Leaders tenants reference guide. So if you're working with a tenant client and working on their work letter or their standard lease, if they're a national client and have a standard lease that they try to execute across their portfolio, you can pull lease clauses right from the reference guide and use them. And then another related question we had, which I'll send over to Greg if you have a response, Greg, and if you don't, that's fine. But a question asked about the language for targeted liquidated damages, and if you have any language for that, particular clause, and what monetary compensation makes sense.
Yeah, thanks, Holly. That's going to be very situation specific. I don't know if that clause is in any of these guides that you've mentioned or others, but it's discussed generally in the I know in the CEB, California Continuing Education of the Bar treatise on office leasing. There's a green leasing chapter. I know it's discussed there. As far as what amount is reasonable, that's really going to be situation specific. It's going to depend on how big the tenant is, how much space they're leasing, how much the rent is, how important whatever the particular disclosure or delivery you're asking for is. So it ought to be reasonable. Of course, you don't want it to be a penalty, but it also ought to be an incentive to perform. So you're just going to have to consider all of that and come up with a number, and maybe something also that is not just a late charge, a one-time thing. Perhaps it's either a daily thing or it goes up weekly, so that you get performance at some point.
Okay, thank you. And Greg, another question probably best sent your way from the audience is, how might integrating green principles into leases differ by size? In other words, are there common challenges for small tenants and small landlords that may not be seen as much with mid to larger landlords or tenants? Any thoughts on that one?
Well, yeah, well, there are a number of things, but one thing that comes to mind first is the separate metering. With very small tenants, it may not be economical to have separate meters, or even check meters or sub meters. With larger tenants, the cost is more easily absorbed. And the other thing is, larger tenants often have even longer lease terms, so it may be easier for like a big box retailer or an office tenant taking a whole bunch of space for a big corporate headquarters is more likely to have a long lease, probably with a bunch of options. So they may well be willing and able to share in some costs that are going to result in some long-term benefits, more than a smaller tenant who may not have either the budget or the term of the lease to absorb it. So I think those are some of the differences.
Great.
Yeah.
Oh, go ahead. Go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
Oh, well, I was just going to comment on your first comment about the metering expense. That kind of plays to another clarifying question we had here, saying metering is expensive. Who pays for this? And I did want to mention that is a challenge and an issue that DOE has tried to address in the past couple of years. We actually put out a technical specification to manufacturers, asking manufacturers to try to build a $100 wireless submeter. because that's really true, that meters typically have been in the $1,000 range, plus expensive installation, and are typically utility grade meters, which may not be quite what's needed in a individual tenant space. So we actually this past spring had a company that responded to that technical specification. We've had many companies respond, but we finally had a company that met all of the technical requirements of that specification. A Miezon meter. This is a company called Miezon that has developed a $100 submeter. So we are in the process of further testing that meter in commercial buildings in a number of locations, but want to let folks know that there are technologies out there that are, dramatically changing the scene for submetering and making that far more feasible in smaller spaces.
Yeah, that's great news, Holly. That has been one of the challenges.
Yeah, absolutely. So it'll be interesting to watch the market, look at this, this product from Miezon, as well as watching the market to see what else comes out there. Let's see, Alex had a clarifying question on the Energy Star tenant space requirements. What's in that, and is it complicated? Alex, would you be able to give us just a quick overview on the 5 pieces of the Energy Star for tenant space fit-out requirement?
Sure. So for the Energy Star for tenant spaces prerequisite requirement that you'll see in that prerequisite that's related to tenants, basically we're asking that spaces are fit out to meet that new Energy Star for tenant space requirement. And I believe that one is broken out into 4 sub-requirements. One is that the space be lit efficiently, so encouraging the use of LEDs. 2 being that there's efficient equipment, so Energy Star labeled office equipment and HVAC, if applicable, equipment would be installed in the space. 3 is that the space be metered efficiently, and so Holly gave a great overview of some of the more cost-effective solutions to submetering. And the 4th requirement is escaping me. Holly, do you know the
I can jump in, yeah. So there are 2 more, actually. One is to estimate energy use of the space. So as your client is designing their new tenant fit out, that they would actually use a really simple tool that's going to be provided by EPA to estimate the usage. And the idea here is just to have a sense of what should my usage in this space be, so that when you are active, when you're occupying the space, you can look at that and say, my usage is 3 times what I thought it would be. Why is that happening? And get used to estimating and then checking on actual usage. And then the last piece, the 5th component, is to share energy data with the landlord. So, these are pretty straightforward requirements. Energy Star and EPA tried to make this very simple, just 5 pieces that you can build into your standard work letter or standard fit out requirements that a client might have for their space. Okay, and also a question regarding timeline for Greenlease Leaders. I guess I can address that one. I think Alex mentioned that the Greenlease Leaders website is open and accepting applications for recognition. If you are an attorney and you have a client that is pursuing some of these Greenlease clauses in a lease, and you think they might be a candidate for recognition, please reach out to us. We'd be happy to help you review what the client is doing and help you develop the application. The application submission window will close about March 1st of 2018, and then we're looking to have recognition at a public conference in the spring of 2018. So that's the timeline for recognition of both tenants and landlords. Let's see what else I have here, if there's anything else that we haven't responded to. Oh, okay. Question says, I'm working with a client on their leases. Do all of their leases have to meet requirements for Greenlease Leaders? And the answer there is no. We understand that, you know, even if you put these clauses into a standard lease so that you're having the conversations with potential landlords or tenants, that all of these various clauses and individual pieces aren't going to make it into every single lease that that your client might execute, and that's okay. The idea here is that we're getting those key clauses and key policies into a company or an organization's standard practice, and therefore those are going to be much more likely to actually go into executed leases. Someone did ask a question about how much square footage in the US is under a green lease, and is there a database that would give that information to the public? We are not aware of such a database. However, we do ask organizations that are recognized as Greenlease Leaders to report to us on the approximate square footage covered by various clauses in their leases. And our count right now is about 3 billion square feet of commercial real estate that is covered under some sort of green lease, purely from reporting of our Greenlease Leader recognized partners. And you can go to the Greenlease Leaders website and again see the recognized organizations to get a sense of who's reporting to us. And you saw that information as well from Alex's slide with some of our key participants so far. I'm looking to see if there are any other questions I should respond to. Well, yes, there are quite a few. We've got a couple more minutes here. Would you have an estimate for how long it takes to prepare a Greenlease Leaders application? We hope that it will be quick and easy. A lot of the work is in making sure that policies and standard leases are in order. So in terms of an estimate, the application itself is an online process that I would think takes under an hour once you have the policies and the documents in place to upload. The conversations that you might need to have internally with, you know, your client or your real estate team or your energy management team or construction folks, that can take a little bit longer. Obviously, that's why we'd love folks to get started early in this process, you know, this fall, so that those policies can be in place when the deadline closes in March. Okay, well, it's 12:59, and I would really like to thank all of the folks who are online in the audience for coming and listening to our two panelists today from IMT and Wendell Rosen, and certainly to thank Alexandra and Greg for joining us and sharing your expertise. Very much appreciated. Thanks, everybody, and have a great rest of your afternoon.